And there's kind of a surprised look on their face when I say no, and I'll talk a little bit more about it later. Healthcare isn't sustainable. And I'll talk about that later in some of my slides. And then another common thing is, oh, I'm not really interested in this thing, I'm not really interested in things like recycling. And what I will show is actually sustainability is much, 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 much way beyond recycling. And then another thing that I often hear is, as a surgeon, what does it have to do with me? What can I do about climate change and what is happening to the world today? So first of all, we'll start with some data. Healthcare does have a carbon footprint. And in fact, healthcare contributes 4.9% to the world's carbon emissions. And that's more than aviation and shipping combined. The average is actually between 5 to 8%. And in fact, at least one high-income country has a healthcare carbon footprint of 10%. But if you think about it, that if that's the average, it means that the low-income countries contribute very little to the carbon footprint, but suffer disproportionately more. If healthcare were a country, it would be the 5th largest emitter on the planet, and that would be smaller than China, the United States, India, and Russia, which are the top 4 emitters on the planet. What about us in the operating theatre? So the operating theatre contributes 20 to 40% of a hospital's carbon footprint. The operating theatre consists of many things that, for instance, our heating, ventilation, and air conditioning systems. That's a huge contribution. Lighting, medical devices, OR kit formulations, reusable medical products, anesthetic gases, fluid management, sterilization. All these contribute to the carbon footprint of the operating theatre. Now, hospitals themselves already have a much higher carbon footprint compared to the community clinics or the general practitioner clinics or just even basic healthcare providers on the ground. And that's because there is such so many high resource devices, consumables, etc., are used in a hospital compared to these other community settings. So just taking through a surgical procedure, the carbon footprint of a surgical procedure actually starts way before you even put your knife on the patient. And it starts with what happens preoperatively: transport of patients and hospital staff, doing the multiple scans, CT scans, MRIs, perhaps an endoscopy, perhaps a biopsy before we decide to operate on a patient. All that has a carbon footprint. And that's before we even bring the patient and put the patient in on table. And then as our surgical procedure starts, you've got anesthetic gases, energy, waste, hand disinfection, surgical linens, the vast majority of which are disposable, and single-use devices. So this Nature review, Gastroenterology and Hepatology, compared 3 types of access for hysterectomy: laparotomy, laparoscopy, and robotic surgery. And of course, laparotomy had the lowest carbon footprint. Laparoscopy had a slightly higher carbon footprint, and robotic had the highest carbon footprint of all. Now, I want to make a disclaimer here. I am definitely not at all recommending that we go back to the days of laparotomizing everyone. Absolutely not, right? As healthcare providers and as pediatric surgeons, we should definitely be choosing the types of surgery that are most clinically beneficial for our patients. But what this does show us is that the choices we make in what we choose for our patient has an impact on the carbon footprint of the surgery as a whole. And one thing that should definitely concern us are that children are disproportionately affected by climate change. We hear very often children are not like little adults. So this is from UNICEF. Their bodies and minds are uniquely vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, such as pollution, deadly diseases, and extreme weather. There are killer childhood diseases that are spreading more quickly and more widely because of climate change and environmental degradation. Children are, of course, more likely to suffer from air pollution than adults. And infants and young children are less able to regulate their body temperatures. So when you're talking about high heat environments, heat waves, or high humidity, high heat environments, such as in our country, in Malaysia or in Southeast Asia, children are much more vulnerable than adults. There's also childhood malnutrition because climate change can lead to crop failures, food prices, and this is exacerbated again by high temperatures and increased rainfall. And extreme weather events. You have a flood and that wipes out the agricultural crop for one season. 40 million children a year have their education disrupted because of disasters caused by climate change. And this number continues to rise. And extreme heat is associated with mental health problems such as post-traumatic stress disorder and depression in children and adolescents. So if anything, it affects the children that we treat, our pediatric patients. And one more thing is that it matters to the next generation. So this is a very well-known study, the Deloitte Global Study. They run this study every year. And the latest one in 2025 surveyed Gen Zs and millennials. And they found that 2/3 of Gen Zs and millennials have felt worried or anxious about the environment in the past month. And some 2/3 are willing to pay more to purchase environmentally sustainable products or services. And nearly half have pressured their employers to take action on protecting the environment. And this detail is not here, but the survey also showed that about a quarter investigated and did some research on a potential employer in terms of their sustainability credentials before even applying for a job in that institution. So to sum up, why should pediatric surgeons care? Why should we care? The world is warming, and we have a lot of data to show it. Healthcare contributes to climate change, so we ourselves are actually contributing to the warming world. The operating theatre is the highest carbon footprint area in a hospital, which means us, in doing what we do day to day and doing the best that we can, we are also contributing to climate change. Children, our patients, suffer from climate change in ways different from adults, and it matters to the next generation, right? So I've set the scene about why I think pediatric surgeons should care. We have a lot of data about how the environment impacts us, and actually we have decades of data. We know about air pollution, we know about water toxicity, water waste, water pollution. We need to change our focus now to action. So we have the data on how the environment impacts our health. We now need to act. How do we therefore change our healthcare practices in a way that values our planet? So step one for me, and I'm just taking you through some of the things that we have done in our setting. So first of all, it's back to the basics, right? First of all, what's the data? Now, I got a few students of mine to observe 20 pediatric surgical procedures over a 3-week period. And they sat in a corner and they looked at, they basically took down notes. They looked at who was throwing what into what bin. So in our operating theatre, we basically have 2 bins, a blue bin, which is the general waste bin, and the yellow bin, which is our clinical waste bin, where we discard all our biohazard stuff. So they found that 2% of items in the general bin were non-general items. Okay, but that's not too bad. Worryingly, they found that 40% of the items thrown into a clinical bin were non-clinical items. They also looked at sharps bin, and they found that 20% of items thrown into the sharps bin were non-sharps items. Now, what does this mean? So 40% sounds really high, but actually there are even some papers that say it's up to 80 to 90% of items thrown into the wrong bin. Now, what does this mean? This means that, first of all, it costs more money to the hospital because it costs more money to process clinical waste compared to general waste. And number 2, it actually consumes much more energy and it produces much more pollution when you process clinical waste, right? So just a very simple thing like throwing into the wrong bin impacts our carbon footprint. What else did we look at? So this is a paper by Rizan et al., where it shows that 68% of carbon contributions in the operating theatre come from single-use items, such as gowns, patient drapes, and instrument table drapes, right? And I think we see that play out in our theatre as well. Another thing that I got my students to do was they basically observed, again, over a 3-week period, the scrub cycle of a surgeon and the scrub team. They measured the water that was left running but unused during the scrub cycle. So in our institution, it's basically we don't use alcohol-based hand rubs before we scrub into theatre. It's basically soap and water, right? And water is left running during the scrub. They measured time in seconds times the estimated flow. And what did they find? So first of all, they found that, of course, on the left here in the lighter blue, the scrub nurses, you can see here I'm guessing that this is pretty much duplicated in many other centers as well. Scrub nurses consistently used more water because they were just more diligent about their scrubbing cycle, right? And so you can see here, scrub nurses always use more water. But what we found was there was a maximum amount of water, about 21 liters, that was left unused. So this is clean water that just literally goes down the drain. And we found that consistently there was about 2/3 of every cycle in which water, good clean water, was left unused per cycle, right? So we've got a bit of data now. My students did many other projects, but this is just, so these are just some of the things that they noted. What next? So then we brought this data to our management. So on the left here, this is one of our auditor's reports, where basically the auditor found that even over a 3-month period, we had exceeded our estimated budget for expenditure for managing clinical waste by about 1/3. On the right here, you see this graphic. We measured our waste produced in just 1 week in our institution, and we found that we produced about 12,000 kilos of clinical waste. So all this basically just means money, right? Money figuratively down the drain for management. And once you've got data, and once you can link that data to money, then management starts sitting up and listening to you when you make suggestions, right? And now we may come with a different intention, and our intention may not be about saving the hospital money, but when we can get data that can be shown, serves both purposes. It is environmentally friendly as well as saves money for management in the hospital. People are much more willing to listen. But this is an article that says that we, as surgeons, really need to be involved in managing operating room waste because we are the leaders. We are the, inverted commas, bosses in the operating theatre. So we need to role model the right behaviors. Next is harnessing the power of simplicity. So what do I mean? So what I like to say is start with the low-hanging fruit first. Start with the pain points where it doesn't affect patient safety and doesn't affect workflow, but actually enhances workflow. So one of the examples I always use is surgical tray rationalization. Now, what is this? So as surgeons, we know that we open large instrument trays, and many of those instruments are not used. But when they are not used, because they've been opened, they still need to be cleaned, washed, and re-sterilized. So there are often many instruments that are open but never used, but they still go through that cycle of being washed and cleaned and sterilized, never used, washed, cleaned, sterilized, never used. So surgical tray rationalization is a systematic reduction in the number of surgical instruments to perform specific procedures without compromising patient safety, but while reducing losses in sterilization and assembly of trays, because sterilization of unused instruments wastes energy, time, and cost. So again, this is some of my student data. They looked at how many instruments remain unused at the end of a procedure. We looked at very common procedures: herniotomy, circumcision, oculopexy, central venous access. Pretty sure these are very common procedures in any pediatric surgical center. They looked at before and after removal of never used instruments. So basically they took pictures of the before and after. Instruments that were never used, they took note, charted it down. And you can see that pretty much, again, consistently, roughly between 1/3 to 1/2 of the number of instruments in the tray are never used at all, right? But remember, these go through the system, wash, clean, re-sterilize, and yet never used. So to close off the loop, we then reviewed our trays and we removed all the items that were never used. And you can see here, looking at the pediatric set, in some sets, we were able to even bring it down to less than half the number of instruments on the tray, right? What does this mean? This means that we've actually halved the size of the tray. Once you halve the size of the tray, you can fit more trays into a sterilization container and into a sterilization machine. And that actually resulted in a 50% reduction in the cost of sterilization when we looked at these cases over the period of January to August 2024. Again, if you can save money, management is always very happy. So the impact of tray rationalization: reduced energy waste in not sterilizing instruments that are not used, more efficient sterilization cycles with larger numbers of smaller trays, and reduced wear and tear of instruments. Something else here that's pretty simple, and I'm pretty sure as surgeons we don't even notice this. This is very much a nursing issue. Is how packaging for surgical instruments happens in the theater, right? So on the left here, you've got on the top of the screen, upper left corner here, we've got an aluminum tray. On the bottom here, you've got a tray that's wrapped in blue paper. So the thing about blue paper is that it is cheap, easy to use, but the problem is they tear easily. So we trialed out the use of a rigid sterilization container versus a wrapping method because sterilization containers protect instruments from damaging drops. They allow better organization and prevent breakthrough issues. They're also environmentally friendlier because they're reusable, so they produce less medical waste. They're more cost-effective in the long term, and they minimize reprocessing work. And I'll show you some numbers to show. So you've got here, on the left here, we've got the 5-year cost comparison between a rigid sterilization container and a wrapping method. And you can see here, of course, the initial cost is high because you've got to buy the rigid container in the first place. And these plastic blue wraps are very cheap. They're only in our currency, 8 ringgit per wrap. Maintenance, of course, is zero in the plastic wrap method because you use and discard, you use and discard. And obviously, there's maintenance involved in the rigid container. However, when you average the total cost over 5 years, it's actually double the price to use the plastic wrapping method compared to the rigid container. And that's just because you don't have to keep buying a new wrap every single time. For a very high volume center such as ours, we are the second largest hospital in our country. So you've got much less waste generated from the use of rigid container. There's a very low reprocessing risk. A container doesn't tear. If a plastic wrap tears, you've got to re-sterilize the entire tray again. There's better instrument protection, and of course, the environmental impact is lower. Right? So simple things doesn't even impact our process, what we do in the theater on the patient, but so much impact on the carbon footprint of a surgical procedure. And then this one is really important. So unfortunately, there's a lot of consumerism that comes into play in surgery. So consumerism is a social and economic order in which the aspirations of many individuals include the acquisition of goods and services beyond those necessary for survival or traditional displays of status. So here, basically, what does it mean? It means that we buy more than we need or will ever need, right? And what does this lead to? It leads to overconsumption, over-exploitation, a large amount of waste from disposable goods, and therefore leads to climate change, reinforces class barriers, and there's creation of inequalities. So many businesses now are looking at what they call the triple bottom line. So it's not just about profit, but also balancing the needs of people and the needs of the planet, right? So, but what does it mean in surgery? I'm pretty sure also that this is a very common scenario. So what happened was that a device rep came and showed me, this is not the photo, this is just a representative photo, right? But basically a device rep came up to me and showed me a very beautiful new instrument that had, for laparoscopic surgery, a new harmonic that had been redesigned. Now, what happens in our center is that because we try to save on the use of materials, we will reuse a device until it cannot be used anymore, right? So we disconnect the cable, we re-sterilize the instrument, and then we reuse the instrument. And what this device rep came up to me is, look, we've got this beautifully new design instrument, but we've redesigned it so that it cannot be reused. Cannot be reused, right? So you have to, once you've used it, you've got to throw it away. It costs about, I think in US is about $800 and the equivalent in our currency. And I had to tell the device rep it's really unlikely that I'm going to purchase this because it just does not make sense to me that such a complex device can only be used once. It's so expensive and it's thrown away. But obviously, there is a consumerist principle here at play because that means it sustains a business. You have to keep buying the device. So what are the drivers of consumerism in surgery? Obviously, first of all, it's the surgeons. Surgeons like new things, like new toys, like the latest innovation, like the latest things. Hospitals and institutions, they may want to show that they are on the cusp, that they are in the forefront of technology, and therefore will purchase new technology, new things, new devices, etc. Patients, of course, because patients may be influenced by various input, from whether it's from peer pressure or from what they read on the internet or read in whatever is given to them. They may think that a single-use device is better because that device is used only for that particular patient and is never used again. And they may think it's safer. That may be their concern. Pharma and device companies are, of course, they are motivated to keep their business going because you have to keep purchasing from them. Payers and funders may insist or may drive the consumerism because it may come across better in terms of their reputation. And of course, public policy may inadvertently drive. So you may have public policy that wants to encourage green businesses, more sustainable practices, but public policy often doesn't keep in step with what is going on in the business world. So they may inadvertently drive consumerism rather than drive green policies. So we as surgeons, we need to think, we need to step back, we need to move away from the mentality of as soon as I need it, I want it, or to have something just in case, but really think, do I need it? Right? And if you go back, if you go back to my example of surgical tray rationalization, you will notice that I focus on very basic, routine, predictable, common procedures, because that's really where you pretty much know what's going to happen, and you pretty much know what instruments exactly you're going to be using. So I wouldn't be suggesting that we for a very complex liver transplant, right, or renal transplant, or long gap atresia with comorbidities, I might not suggest it, right? So I would suggest just starting with very basic, routine, core procedures that are very predictable. And very, very importantly is, of course, as a surgeon, we need to value the power of the right team. And in this, I would say, don't start with the surgeons, because the surgeons are always usually concerned, okay, what if I need that instrument? But I want that instrument. But this is the particular type of instrument that I want, and this is the particular type of device that I want. So I work very closely with my operating theatre matron, who's also very committed to sustainability, and she's the one who actually has tried, has run initiatives on surgical tray rationalization, as well as on the sterilization containers. I work also with facilities and engineering, absolutely key, absolutely core, because so much of an operating theatre carbon footprint comes from things like HVAC and lighting. And the pharmacists. So the pharmacists are really helpful because, so in our setting, and again, I think it's pretty similar in many other settings, in our setting, our pharmacists in their processes generate about 300 kilograms of waste per day just from taking in all the pharmaceuticals that come into the hospital and sending them out again, right? So they see every day the amount of waste that's generated. So they're really committed to this. However, I'm also really very encouraged because I gave a talk like this on sustainable surgery in Taiwan in March. And I gave that talk as part of an international forum that also included the presidents of the colleges of surgeons of Thailand and the Philippines and Malaysia. And after that talk, we had a commitment to sign a joint advocacy statement on sustainable surgery. And we signed that statement just 2 weeks ago at our annual Congress of the College of Surgeons of the Academy of Medicine of Malaysia. So while it sometimes can feel that not everyone realizes the importance of climate change, I do think that as surgeons, particularly as pediatric surgeons, once there is an awareness, there is a drive to commitment. So we're really proud of this. So just a few more things about some of the data that is out there, right? Now, this is from an organization called Healthcare Without Harm. And what they wanted to show was that if we're starting from here, right? If we make no change at all to our processes, business as usual, our carbon footprint, our emissions are just going to go up. If we progress in line with energy and climate commitments from 2017, we can reduce the gradient of the line, but it is also possible to drop the gradient of the line so that we're actually in negative, so that we are actually reducing in absolute numbers our impact on the environment. And I think, Adrian, you mentioned it just now as well. The Royal College of Surgeons at Edinburgh has a net zero operating theatre initiative. And I'm seeing more and more of this, especially in many of the high-income countries. And I'm hoping that because in our LMIC countries, we actually suffer more from climate change, and our populations suffer disproportionately more from climate change, that we will also be able to jump on this vision of reducing our carbon footprint in the operating theatre. So I just want to acknowledge all these people, many of our management, our dean, our hospital director, our medical students, and various people in our departments, and our Green at UM Health Steering Committee and Task Force. So thank you very much. I'd love to take questions. And that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Shireen, for your very great talk. I'm really amazed by the work you have done, from asking your students to help you with identifying the issue, and to the advocacy work, and finally leading to the joint statement in your home country. Is really amazing, especially I cannot imagine to start with a pediatric surgeon and affecting the whole industry of the surgery in the country. So I'll start with the first question first. And so I believe that although we hear the success of your story, but I believe there must be a lot of obstacles you encounter when you try to instill the concepts to any healthcare professional in your home country, especially for the surgeon, I believe. So can you tell us any fun story, or any big obstacle that you encounter when you communicate with the surgeons?
Yeah, so I think because so obviously a big thing is robotic surgery, right? So we just got our robot last year. After years of saying we need a robot. And of course, someone who is very keen on robotic surgery, and I want to emphasize that we must continue to do what is right for our patients. So if MIS is right for our patients, we continue to do MIS, right? So it's not that I'm against robotic surgery, right? And but it was quite interesting to see the reaction when I showed that number. Robotic surgery, it's pretty much twice the carbon footprint of just your regular MIS, right? And then you can kind of see the surgeons like, oh, okay, oh no, but we can do this, we can reuse, some of the drapes, and we can reuse some of the instruments, and those instruments can be used 3 times, right? Okay, so that there's that reaction. Now, I think what I have noticed is why I keep talking about starting with the low-hanging fruit is, I think we have to start where people are, right? So, for example, if you are not really impacting very complex surgeries, that's where you start. You start with the simple surgeries. And an interesting thing that we found is that, so my OT matron, she looked at my data and she said, okay, I'm going to do it for our general surgery team, right? So the adult general surgery, not pediatric surgery, right? So I'm going to do it for adult general surgeons, and I'm going to remove all the items that are never used in their laparotomy set. All right. So she did it. She sat down with a couple of surgeons, said, okay, what do you need? What don't you need? Remove those. And then people asked, so what happened? Did they get upset? And they said, they didn't even notice that those instruments were gone, which actually just goes to show you that they were never used in the first place. And when you first broach the subject, they'll say, but what if I need it? What if I want it for that particular surgery? But nobody ever noticed that those instruments were gone. Yeah.
Yeah, I think the trick is you don't tell them. And then yes, realize that they actually don't need them, actually.
Yes,
so it's,
exactly.
Quite interesting. Okay. Yeah. So today we also have Professor Go Miano as the joint moderator here today. So yeah, do you want to speak?
Yeah, it's actually in Japan, we never care about the ecology, like CO2 footprint and water use too much, non-use instrument. We never care about it. But I think definitely that's important. But for the surgeon as well as for the hospital, they must care about the profit instead of the ecology or something. So how do you educate them, or how do you convince them to that those things are important for the for the hospital as well? It must be difficult for you.
Yeah, so I think that's one of the ideas that people have that may not be true, is that doing something that's environmentally friendly is more expensive. Because in fact, the data that I showed was even very basic steps could save the hospital money, right? And I think it's because we have not done anything at all, or there's very little emphasis on it. And therefore, there's a lot of room to move in which we, just by streamlining processes and reducing waste, we're actually saving the hospital money. And then once you save the hospital money, they're much more willing to then listen to your other suggestions. I think that's one. But number two, I must also say that I had a lot of support from the hospital director and our dean of the Faculty of Medicine, because they were already convinced about the principles of sustainability. So I think once you have upper management that is already convinced about why we do it, then it's a matter of just matching our data so that we can at least show we're not going to put the hospital in a negative balance. We can at least maybe save money and then at least make it balanced. But I also often get this question, well, it's expensive because I need a green building, right? In Malaysia, our issue is that because it's always hot, we have air conditioning on all the time. I think that it's a different challenge in different environments. So I think probably for somewhere like the UK or Japan, in winter, you might be thinking about insulation and heat loss rather than air conditioning. But because we are so reliant on air conditioning, we often have a situation where there's nobody in the office, there's nobody in the room, or there's nobody in that area, but the air conditioning is still on. And what my engineering team did was that they just upgraded the air conditioning to a much more efficient cooling system. And they saved the hospital about 100,000 ringgit in electricity bills.
I think, economy situation and, industry or climate situation is always different in each country.
Yeah.
So maybe some, if possible, prospective study or something in international, it might be very interesting or attractive.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, sir. Okay, sorry, that's my son.
I think
a pediatric
Hello.
patient, yes.
Yeah. I think Paul would like to talk.
Sure, yeah, go ahead.
Hug,
Yes.
hug, hug.
Hi, Shireen.
Hey, hi, Paul. Nice to see you.
Yeah, good. Yeah, I can't
I
see
don't see you
myself.
though. I don't see you.
Yeah, I can't see myself on the
I
either.
can see a picture.
Yeah, I can see a picture.
I can't see myself on the screen. I don't know what happened. Anyway, so in Taiwan, because the cost of the healthcare is controlled by the government, so every surgery costs the same wherever you go. So hospital cut down the cost of everything. So at least in my hospital, we still use cloth drapes and surgical gowns, and that's been patched, so and patched and reused every time. And then we do have different trays for different type of surgeries, but then you need to buy a lot of trays because it takes time, turnover time, one tray to come in the next. And if they need one X-ray instrument, it takes time to bring it down from upstairs. And previously, we secretly used the ligature for 3 patients illegally. So once we used it, we clean it. I'll hide it in my cupboard for the next patient without insurance or whatever. But then the government disallowed that for patient safety. So yeah, that sometimes makes it difficult to do.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks, Paul. In fact, that was some of the feedback that we got when I presented at the Taiwan Surgical Association as well. I mean, first of all, you can now say that there is absolutely no shame at all. In fact, you can take pride in reusing and patching up your cloth drapes and gowns, right? So I think that's great. They did bring up the issue of patient safety, and I think that is an important one, because whenever we make changes, we want to be sure that patient safety is not affected by what others might see as just a cost-cutting measure rather than an environmentally friendly procedure, right? But there actually is enough data to show that it doesn't impact patient safety. So you say that you secretly use your LigaSure 3 times. I will say that we not so secretly use our LigaSure many times, right? Because actually, it's such a good instrument that can be used so many times, and it just seems so wasteful, especially I think in low resource settings. And I'm not even talking about Malaysia here. I think there are many countries with much lower resources that this would be such a valuable tool, so that unfairness and that inequality already comes across very clearly. Yeah. So there is already, what I'm trying to say is that there's already data that shows that there are some measures that do not impact patient safety. And a lot of the practices that were brought over because, it was BSE, bovine encephalopathy, right? Creutzfeldt disease, which actually there's also a lot of data that shows that this prions, right? That's just not a consideration anymore. Yeah. Oh, I can see your face now, Paul.
Thanks, Adrian. I think in America, I heard that they also start to sterilize the instruments, expensive instruments in America. But it's by the original company, but then they sell it back to the hospital at a lower price. If we sterilize by ourselves, it doesn't cost anything.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's a trend that's going to happen all over the world. I'm sure the Americans are they waste more instrument than we do.
Yeah. So another thing that I realized also is our instruments. So we used to have an in-house repair service, but that in-house repair service stopped. And every time instruments get spoiled, they actually discard it and we buy a new instrument. So we've restarted an instrument refurbishment service. So not repair, but we actually send it back to one of our providers, and they refurbish the instrument to be almost new, and they provide a warranty of 6 months after they refurbish. So to buy a new instrument costs maybe about 200 to 300 ringgit in our currency, but to refurbish it costs about 50 ringgit. So again, we just using environmentally friendly principles, but showing that we can actually save the hospital money. But of course, the strange thing is, it's in that bureaucratic way, we have a budget to purchase new instruments, but we don't have a budget to refurbish instruments. So then we have to write a paper to argue for why we need to refurbish instruments rather than purchase new instruments.
Yeah, we still have the in-house engineers, so everything have to go through them first before they get sent out for repairs. That saves a bit of money for the hospital.
Yeah. I don't know, maybe Adrian, if you are in London now or go in Japan, what I guess what do you see that is different in the settings that you're in, and what are the attitudes perhaps that are different? Because I know in terms of the attitudes here, there's still a very little awareness about the issue. I think there's a lot more awareness in places like the UK.
Yeah, maybe I talk first because I just been to UK for a week only, and maybe I can talk about Hong Kong situation first, which I'm more familiar. I think for Hong Kong, we are not quite, but majority of the surgeons are actually not quite familiar with the topic of sustainability. I think not only the pediatric surgeon, but it's a surgeon as a whole. So in fact, I also would like to start something to investigate the awareness of sustainability of surgeons in Hong Kong, because I think we have to know the knowledge gap among all the surgeons before we know what we can do. And I'm sure if you ask the various surgeons in Hong Kong, they probably don't know what means by sustainability or what exactly we should do to kind of maintain this kind of sustainability. I think the most straightforward concept they would think, oh, it's just recycle, and that is probably that they think about. But I think as what Shireen shared is not something as simple as that. So I do believe that a lot of things for us to do for the situation of Hong Kong. And for UK, I can see that quite a few colleges of surgeons in UK, like England and also Edinburgh, they have the concepts of a green surgery. But I'm actually in the tea room, so I can't say so loudly. But I think at least from the from a few information that I see, I don't particularly see something very green. But anyway, I hope I can leave the tea room for a while. But anyway, I think the awareness, despite all these statements in the UK at college, I don't think that they are very actively doing that as well, because the obstacles are still there. I think surgeons as a whole, they tend to wish for convenience and safety before we want to keep the earth healthy. So that could be the obstacles that we see, even in the situation of UK, or maybe Go can share Japan's situation.
Well, we again, we don't care about ecology things, but because of there is an issue of the high prices in Japan, especially in the Tokyo. So, we are tending to naturally reduce the waste. So that's a part of the ecology, but basically that's only the reason we try to reduce the waste. But we are not, familiar with this, those. Basically, we don't care about the CO2 footprint and water use or instrument usage. We are still old-fashioned. So, actually, personally, I learned a lot from your presentation today. So, thank you so much.
I believe there is definitely much work to be done. And Shireen, we actually have two questions online. So
Yes,
the first
okay.
question is from let me see, Ahmed. And in your experience, what has been the biggest challenge to implement change institute? How do you overcome these challenges? It's the lessons for us to implement in other centers we work in.
Yes. Okay. So so first of all, I have to say that although this is something that I have been interested in for some time, and actually to go back to your statement just now, Adrian, about surveying, just basically surveying attitudes and knowledge amongst the surgeons. So we actually already did that. My students also surveyed the surgeons in our operating theatre, and we published it in PSI, actually, in Pediatric Surgery International. So that's I think that was last year. So we got some data on that. And interestingly, what we found was that we assumed that the older surgeons wouldn't care as much. But actually, we found that the more experienced surgeons had come to realize that this is something that they need to care about. So there was actually more input and more engagement from the older surgeons than the newer surgeons, who I think were just more focused on their training, on making sure that their logs were completed, that they've gone in for all the surgeries that they needed to, right? So the triage in their mind was very different. But going back to this, so this has been something that I've been interested in. But of course, as a surgeon, that's a full-time job, right? And then to extend it to include looking at sustainability in the operating theatre, that's a half a full-time job, right? And then once you start getting the data, my management wanted me to look at the entire hospital. That's two extra full-time jobs, right? But at the end of the day, I think we just have to identify what we feel has an impact for what we do, right? And I think my personal challenge and obstacle was not that I didn't have support. In fact, I have a lot of support from management. I think it's more that because there's so few of us who even know about this or are aware about this, we're starting with a very small base of even the team or experts in this. And everyone who is interested in this, especially in the operating theatre, they already have full-time jobs, right? So I've got an ophthalmologist, I've got a pediatric anesthetist, I've got an obstetrician, gynecologist, etc. They're all very interested, but they're all very busy people. They're all senior consultants. So I think the next step for me would be trying to build that base where it becomes a train the trainer scenario. So we train the next batch and educate the next batch, and then they therefore can then educate further on. I think that is really one of the major things, just a lack of people who understand this at all. Because ESG outside is a very known thing, right? ESG has existed for many years. There are many companies with chief sustainability officers, but when you're looking at healthcare per se, there's actually very little movement in this area. But it's good. In the past 5 years, I've seen a lot more movement. Yeah, so I think that certainly for me would be my obstacle and challenge.
Okay. And the second question is from Li Wei Jiang. Is there any movement among the device manufacturer towards making more sustainable products? That's quite an interesting question.
Oh, yeah. Liu is asking a very challenging question. I always say that I think I've hit a lot of the low-hanging fruit that we've identified. Actually, the next thing I want to look at is procurement. Now, what does that mean? It means that we need to embed sustainability criteria when we purchase something, right? So when we tender for our lab stacks or tender for our devices or suture materials, etc., we add a component of sustainability. And that means that the companies have to answer to us, okay, how are we making our items more sustainable? And if, all being equal, got good patient safety profile, got good handling profile, it's a nice suture, good suture, lasts well, does its job, that should make the difference. I honestly think which is why one of the reasons I put the power of the consumer in my slides is because I think we need to push. A business is not going to do it because the business is invested in making profit. Okay, so I can show you one example, right? So a suture company, a suture rep came to present on their sutures in my unit, and they ended with a slide on a take-back mechanism for their suture needles, right? So they take back, process, recycle, and then they actually reproduce new needles from that material. I said, oh, great. Tell me, how do I do this? Tell me, how do I set it up? And they said, oh, it's actually not available in Malaysia, not available in this country. But they're telling me about it, but it's not available in the country, right? So I think that there is that element of kind of telling you that they're doing something, but when you ask further about it, they don't do it. So I really feel that we have to push as consumers. Having said so, I have recently worked with an excellent company. They seem really genuine in their efforts, and that is B. Brown. I think B. Brown is a family-run company, and no conflict of interest here. They don't pay me anything. Okay, I've spoken at one event, but I was not paid any honorarium. Okay, so just a disclaimer here. But I did speak at their sustainability meeting. They gathered the APAC region gathered their sustainability managers, and they do seem to be honestly and genuinely trying to change their processes so that they reduce their carbon footprint. So that's still open. So I think watch the space. We've got another 2 questions. So Dayang is asking me, have I made any changes to my surgical wards with regards to sustainability? Yeah, so the first thing we're tackling in our wards are so the ward challenges, every area has a different challenge, right? OT is a very protocolized area, right? You know what needs to happen. You know what happens when a patient enters the door and leaves the door. In theater, there are a lot of processes, but the wards are much more fluid and much more, I would say, maybe even more chaotic. And even a surgical ward is very different from a medical ward. So what we are starting with is basic waste management. So that's our next step for the wards. Especially in our surgical wards. Our surgical ward has one of the highest generating waste areas in our hospital. We've looked at the data already. So we're actually running waste management workshops to, again, train the trainers. So training our nurse managers to just look at simple things like waste segregation. Waste segregation is a very low-hanging fruit because you've got the process there. It's a matter of people just doing the right thing. Right? So that, again, also very easy to convince because they can see that immediate input in terms of how much money they're saving in not processing clinical waste unnecessarily. Right? So that's what we're going to do in our wards. Prof. Nabila also has a question. When we talk about green surgery and sustainability, what about quality, SSI, sepsis possibilities in LMICs, constrained resources in reusing drapes and instruments, etc.? Oh, great question, Prof. Nabila. I think that is definitely a very important question that we need to answer. So we are actually running a test run in one of our daycare surgery theaters together with our pediatric ophthalmology team, looking at whether there are any increased SSI rates by changing some of our processes. But I think if you look at the initiatives that we are trying to do, there's nothing we're changing at the moment that would impact SSI. I think what may impact SSI is if we reuse. But if we re-sterilize and clean, we're basically just going back to what we used to do 20 years ago. So, I don't think the data shows that there are increased SSIs. There is a challenge with reusable drapes because we know that waterproof drapes reduce the risk of SSI. So there are now waterproof textiles, so waterproof reusable textiles that are available in the market now. Not a lot, not easy to find, but in fact, in Taiwan, Paul, there was a medical expo where I actually saw a stall that was selling waterproof reusable textiles. So again, I think it's us as a consumer, we need to push it more. Once we demonstrate that there is a market, the market will respond.
Thank you, Shireen. And I think we all have a very fruitful webinar tonight. So as a pediatric surgeon, we are not only treating our patient's body and family, we also have a responsibility to create a bright future on society and even environment for our next generation. So I think this topic is really suitable for all of us here, and we all learn a lot from Shireen's talk. Thank you very much for giving us a very great talk tonight. And also thanks to Go and also Paul for helping us in kind of moderating these sessions today. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
All right.
So if you have no further discussions or comment, then we can end the webinar tonight. And thank you very much. And we hope to see you all later again. And then as our third webinar in the future. Thank you very much.
All right. Thanks so much. Thanks everyone.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Have a good day wherever you are. Good night and good day.
Bye.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.